On February 13, 1961, Chester Weiger went on trial. Jury selection took almost 2 weeks. The new state's attorney, Robert Richardson, argued for the prosecution. Anthony Racuglia assisted him. The judge at the trial was Leonard Hoffman. Richardson and Racuglia wanted to put Chester behind bars so badly that they decided to charge him with only one of the 3 murders. In this way, they ensured themselves in case of a mistake or acquittal. After all, Chester could then be charged with the other 2 murders and have 2 more trials. The prosecution wanted to seek the death penalty for Weiger. When it came time for the prosecution, Chester continued to claim that the confession had been coerced out of him with threats, including guns and the death penalty. The defendant's father also made the threats. He claimed that when he and his son spoke on November 17th, the day before the confession, Chester had already been threatened with the electric chair. Another critical point in this case was that Chester was arrested before the so-called Miranda rule law. An arrestee can remain silent, and anything he says will be used against him. It's a phrase you and I hear in the movies every time in these situations. He wasn't told that. There was also no Brady v. Maryland precedent at the time, which will make it settled that the prosecution must always turn over all data to the court, even data that clear the defendant of suspicion. Well, that is, in this case, the crime labs found many exciting things that had nothing to do with Chester's local crime, but he and his lawyer couldn't even know about it. So the prosecution covered up those facts. I've listed some of them, and we'll touch on some of these critical facts. So, the trial had only Chester's confession, which he later retracted, saying he gave it under the oath. However, a psychiatrist, a doctor by the name of Craglick, disagreed with the version about confession under pressure. He spoke to Chester after his confession, and in Craglick's opinion, Weiger acted as if he was relieved to have told the truth. Chester confessed to the doctor that he often dreamed of people breaking into his house and trying to arrest him and take him away. Now, he was no longer plagued by nightmares. On February 27th, Chester himself was given the floor at the trial, and he told again about that very day. Since his partner was off work on Mondays, he was forced to do his duties for him. So he was very busy at the alleged time of the murder. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he sat down in the lobby to write a letter to his mistress. He had shaved in the evening, so there were scratches on his face. These scratches were a rather important part of the prosecution's case against the defendant. Most witnesses called to the stand were expected to confirm or deny their presence on Chester's face that day, and there was complete confusion with the testimony of co-workers about the scratches. Although in the first interviews with the police, almost no one mentioned the injuries on his face, then at the trial, one by one, they remembered that there were scratches. So Chester's shaving version was not heeded by either the juror or the judge. Another piece of evidence was his jacket with tiny drops of blood, which, however, it is not clear how it got there, because in his confession, Chester said that he carried the women into the cave on his own, throwing them over his shoulder, in which case the jacket would have been red with blood. The stick found at the site was also considered necessary evidence, indirectly confirming his involvement. Even though shortly before the trial, the forensic laboratory concluded that the blood on the stick was not from blows, but from moving. And then, of course, there's his confession. That's pretty much it. At the time, detectives believed that a confession, even if not entirely of the suspect's free will, was enough. An innocent man wouldn't confess. And on March 4th, almost a year after the attack on the women in Starved Rock Park, the jury reached a verdict on Chester Weiger. Guilty. On his 22nd birthday, he was sentenced to life in prison. The trial is over. Case dismissed. After Judge Hoffman dismissed the jury, they were surrounded by reporters. They wanted to know why the jury had made that decision, why not the death penalty, because he would have a chance at parole. And apparently, the jury had doubts. It wasn't confident that the police had caught the one. So, taking his life based on a confession seemed to some of the jurors a bit of too harsh. That says something. Harlan Warren was rewarded for catching the killer, and his assistants, as well as a polygraph expert, were not left out. They split the reward, received money and women who told about meeting with a strange guy a couple of days before the murder in the canyon, as well as the teacher of the girl who was attacked in Matheson Park, because it was she who pointed out the similarity of incidents. The sums they all received were quite large for the times. Chester Weiger was sent to Statesville Prison in Joliet, where he would spend virtually the rest of his life. And at first, for a full 44 years, it was as if Chester Weiger was forgotten about. But that is until a lawyer, or lawyer if you will, named Donna Kelly, became interested in his case. In the year 2004, she presented an affidavit from 88-year-old Ben Franklin at a regular parole hearing. He was the owner of a barbershop in a town near Oglesby. According to Franklin, Chester was at the barbershop at the time the women were allegedly attacked. But Ben, unfortunately, could not give the exact time. He only said that Chester came in the afternoon. Franklin remembered that between 5:30 and 6 p.m., Weiger left the barbershop and noticed an airplane in the sky. Ben left the customer and walked over to Chester. Franklin watched the plane for a while, and Chester said he was late for work and left. Chester and Weiger will later ask why he didn't mention that alibi right away, because there's a man here who's willing to stand up for him and say he couldn't have been there, right there in that park. Chester will answer that he could not agree with Franklin to support him and thought that it would be better to tell a different story than to try to somehow reconcile the testimony with another person. The other version is that either it was said by Weiger himself, or in general something was somehow twisted and shifted around in general, as if Franklin himself was supposed to come to the trial, but said at the trial that he wasn't there. Well, there was something wrong with that alibi. There's no way to know if Chester was there or not. There was no CCTV. Apparently, no one else saw them together. Donna also presented at the parole hearing the facts we mentioned above, that there was no direct evidence and that the confession was beaten out of him. But all of this was again left unaddressed because of pressure from Anthony Raccouli, who assured that Chester was still lucky and alive and preserved his life. He should not be granted parole. He was already taken pity on. Chester remained imprisoned, and those who believed in his innocence kept looking for something to hang on to. Thus, a specific deathbed confession was discovered by a confident woman in 1982 or 1983 years. A Chicago police sergeant by the name of Mark Gibson, in 2006 years, provided an affidavit setting forth this confession of hers. It was used in court to support a motion for new DNA tests in the Starved Rock murder case. In the affidavit, Gibson stated that he and a co-worker, now deceased, were once called to the hospital. There lay a terminally ill patient who wanted to clear her conscience. The woman told Gibson that she had been at a park in Utica and something had gotten out of hand. Several people, she said, were killed and their bodies dragged away. Gibson said the woman's daughters, who were also at the hospital at the time, were prevented from finishing the story by screaming that their mother had lost her mind and ordered police officers to leave the hospital. In his testimony, Gibson did not give the exact interview date or the woman's name, but said he gave the information to the detective, but it was unclear if any police action followed. The reason why it wasn't brought up until the 2006 year is also unknown. But this confession was ultimately not allowed to go to trial. But new DNA tests were decided to be done after all. But there was a problem. Because of poor storage conditions, some of the samples had gone bad. For example, it turned out that Chester's jacket had been in the same bag as the victim's clothes for years. The coat was also given to the local Boy Scouts to try on, and the stick, like a gun, was put on public display in the police station. Since the very 60s, the people of the neighboring towns had not relented all this time. They argued and quarreled with each other, and their opinions divided into two camps: those who believed that Chester was justly imprisoned and that an innocent man was in prison. Arguments about the case were as fierce as politics. Families crumbled because of disagreements over the case. Everyone had their own opinions and their arguments. In the early noughties, David Raculia, son of Anthony Raculia, the man who essentially put Chester behind bars, decided to explore why this story, after all these years, continues to be as controversial as political topics. So he started making a documentary. His father was very skeptical of the idea. "What? You don't trust your father? Do you think I could put an innocent man in jail? Do you think I did it for money and fame?" In this documentary, parts of which made it into a mini-series on HBO, he speaks to supporters of both camps and those directly involved in the investigation and trial themselves, Chester Weiger himself and his family. The filming eventually stretched over many years. Chester continued to be denied parole all this time, and David was filmed talking to journalists and lawyers. And finally, in 2019, Anthony Raculia died. In February 2000, Chester Weiger, already 80 years old, was released on parole. Some people believe that these two events are connected. They say the thing that kept Chester behind bars was Anthony Raculia, and once he was gone, Chester Weiger was released. To this day, Weiger continues to claim that his charges were trumped up, that he wasn't in the park that day and didn't commit anything criminal. When he was released from prison, he was sent to a shelter for elderly ex-convicts, where he continued to live as a prisoner because COVID-19 began. So, Chester is out, albeit on parole, but there's still a sense of understatement. Let's break down the theory versions now, and what Chester's new lawyer, Andy Hale, is doing in the year 2023. How will he prove that Chester Weiger spent his entire life in prison for nothing? He went to jail at 22 and got out at 80-something. Chester went to prison before sending a man to the moon, before the invention of the internet, before the September 11th terrorist attack that changed the world, and before the crazy technological breakthrough of the late noughties. But none of that matters much compared to the fact that he outlived almost his entire family. His mother and father died while he was in prison. His wife died, and he wasn't even at their funeral. His son went to prison many times. He only saw his father there because they were once housed in the same institution. So Chester's whole life has been spent in jail. Now, a man is sure of his innocence and plans to prove it and get massive compensation for his life. Andy Hale recorded an entire season of the podcast about this, and the latest updates came out just this spring. Andy also found out that the woman on the jury admitted to him that she regretted her decision her whole life. So, there were doubts, even in court, by the people deciding to put him away or pardon him. Having watched the documentary series and listened to 18 hours of podcasts, I can't say that the investigation was quality and coherent either. And I'm sure if you thought Chester was guilty, you'll soon doubt it. But also, if you were sure Chester was immaculate too, you might have doubts. Well, maybe not. Many people believe that the evidence used to convict Weiger would not stand up to scrutiny today, and it really would. When Dave Raculio would ask his father how they could put a man in jail on a confession alone, he would say, "Don't even try to explain such an old case with today's rules of law and morality. It was typical back then. We caught the bad guy. We knew he was terrible, and how we put him away didn't matter at all. Today, they say it's impossible. You remember this Harland Warren, the state's attorney on this case? Well, his daughter and part-time secretary, Ann Lawrence Smith, found a handwritten document, probably written by him, on his desk after he died at 2007. It outlined a step-by-step plan to put a guilty man away, use psychological pressure to get him to confess. Talk about that red and white airplane as an explanation for why the bodies were found in the cave. This document was written before Chester was admitted, so it could confirm that detectives and prosecutors were determined to put someone away, to close this case sooner rather than later. I mean, really, what motive could Chester have? They were punched over 120 times. And then Chester goes to work? There's no blood on his clothes, apart from the spatter on his jacket. However, this was a crime committed in a state of violent rage. Judging by the facial injuries, it was a personal, private attack. He was directed at one of the women, or all three. The official story, and Chester confesses that he wanted to steal the bag, but instead of the bag, he had a camera in his hand, and he then tied them up. One of them attacked him, and he had to straighten them all out. Question: how did a simple robbery go from 0 to 100 to this? He ties them up so they can't catch up with him while he returns to the hotel. Okay. But a careful examination of the ropes revealed that the ropes were not torn, but cut. And it's like they were even cut with different knives. Chester doesn't mention that in the confession or anywhere else. Did he have a knife with him? That's not clear either. And the other thing, everyone, and I'm sure you're still wondering, how a small, skinny man like Chester could overpower 3 middle-aged women and then drag their bodies up into the cave by himself. But to be fair, this is where the story of, remember, survivor Coerced comes to mind. That's the Richard Speck case. He single-handedly killed 8 girls. They lost count of them, and in the end, one of them managed to escape him and survive. But he did, so this one could too. But Richard Speck was pretty considerable. First of all, and second, he was operating in a house. This one's out in the open. The girls there were young, fragile students. Here he was dealing with women in their 50s. And he not only had to take them down, but he had to get each one up on a 1.5 meter high ledge, so it's worthy of discussion. But who else would we suspect if not Chester Wicker? And that's probably the most critical question, because there's something to discuss at least then. Well, the personalities of interest are dozens. Andy Hale, for example, spoke at length about the Boy Scouts at a local camp. They said there were a lot of troubled teenagers there in their 16th to 19th years who might have committed such a crime. There were 36 boys at the camp in those days. They were divided into groups of 5 or 6. Each had a counselor in charge of the children, but the Boy Scouts were not allowed to go anywhere they wanted, even on their own time. And when the children visited Starved Rock Park, they were always under adult supervision. Nevertheless, Andy Hale pays special attention to a kid named Jerry Nmy. He was among the kids who found the women that day, and they found them, as we remember, rather quickly. He was 16 or 17 years old at the time. He was a troubled teenager. He was sent to Camp Marseilles, near Starved Rock Lodge. Why did he get the attention? All because on the weekend after what happened in the park, he gets out to Chicago, meets a young server, and then her body is found on the railroad tracks. And that's where it gets interesting. Her face was just destroyed, probably with a brick. She had no clothes on her lower body either. Jerry is caught and sentenced to death. But at some point, his sentence will be commuted to life. And shockingly, when he was convicted, The jury foreman's house burned down a week later. His wife and daughter died in the fire. And when asked who could have done it, he said, "The only enemy I have is Jerry Nmy. He's the only one who could have done it. Well, as revenge." But that's not the last odd thing. This sworn chairman worked for the Illinois Bell Company. His boss was Herman Oeting, husband of Lillian Oeting, who died in the park. So either it's a small world, or it's not a coincidence. And while we're on the subject, let's move on to this boy, Jerry Nmy. He's been in trouble since he was a kid. He didn't get in trouble, he just made it. When he was 7, he was first arrested for stealing a bicycle. At 12, he shoplifted and sold oral sex in the park. At 14, he met a girl, changed into her clothes, and robbed a liquor store. All this time, he was either in a particular school, a reform camp, or another school of some sort, or almost in a mental institution. But in the end, he was given a psychological evaluation and told that he was not a danger to society. I mean, he could be released into the world, and that's how he ends up in Marseille. And then he escapes from there to Chicago and kills. They put him away for life. But that's easy too. He ended up making friends with everybody there. He was such a nice boy and knew where to push the buttons. And he got out on parole, and he was young enough at the time. He marries a woman, divorces her, remarries her, and she's found dead in a motel, multiple stab wounds and wounds on her body. And Jerry Nmy himself has an alibi. He was somewhere else. His wife's case remains unsolved. It's a story within a story, but listen, it's chilling. Jerry died a short time ago, 1921. So there's a lot of longevity in this story. I guess it has to do with where they were born. There's a park nearby, ecology and everything. So he has a post on Facebook made in the year 2017 on March 23rd. I wonder if anyone has any pictures of me. I thought I always managed to stay invisible. Writes, write what emotions you feel about this inquiry and this post. But as for the Stardock case, his hair was taken for analysis back during the initial investigation, and apparently those hairs did not match those found at the scene. He also had an alibi. So he was the killer, but not in this case. And why he used the same method as the attackers in Stardock is unclear. Maybe he was just very impressionable and decided to do it again. Either way, you'll agree the story is worthy of our inclusion in this video. The following suspects were hotel owner Nick Spears and his son. Donna Kelly also felt that closer attention should be paid to the figure of the hotel owner's son. His name was George Spears. He was 28 years old at the time of the crime, and he knew the area well. He even had fabric samples taken from his clothes, as we recall, and he passed a polygraph. What was disconcerting was that he changed his statement several times, and the way the hotel staff described him. Get ready. They said he was always watching everyone as he enjoyed it. He was peeping on people, waiting for them somewhere. He'd peek in windows and show up unexpectedly. People just avoided him. What was also disturbing was that he was an excellent boxer, and on the day of the attack, he was supposed to go to see his mother and sister, who were, by the way, very similar to the dead women. And he was an hour late for the meeting. This story only gets better. As soon as Donna decided to look into all of this and plead it out in court, on April 30th, 2015, Nick killed himself. It's an extraordinary moment. He bought a week's worth of food. He bought his dog a bag of food. He entered the house, turned on the water, and stripped down. Then he uses one gun to kill the dog and another to kill himself while sitting at his computer. Rumor has it that he did it because he was afraid of being found out about his involvement in the murders in the park. It happened on May 2nd, just days after Donna officially announced her suspicions and intentions. But to be fair, Nick Spiros did have throat cancer, and that can be put down to his illness and perhaps an unwillingness to accept the disease. But here's another interesting fact. Chester Weiger gets on the police radar precisely because of the testimony of George Spiros, a suspect at the time. In April 1966th year, he spoke to the police, and he did it several times. The first time he didn't mention anything important about Chester. Still, the second time, he suddenly remembered seeing several cars in the canyon, but didn't remember if anyone was in them. The third time in the interview, he says that Chester and his friend Stanley were in the car. And he says it strangely, not that I remember it, but he uses this formulation. The more I think about it, the more I want to put Weiger and Stanley in that place. And the police, against all odds, believed him. The third time. And they didn't even consider that he had called the police before that and said he had seen Indians catching a deer in the park. But wait a minute, Indians haven't been there in over 100 years. So, how much of his testimony could be believed at all? After that, George abruptly ceased to be a suspect, and all attention shifted to Chester Weiger. And we can assume his father was in on it. After all, the family had plenty of money. Who knows what strings he pulled to get his boy left alone? But that's just a theory. Let's move on. In the 60s, a young criminalist named William Jensen compiled a 40-page report on the case. He felt that the police had failed in their task. They could not investigate the crime scene properly and misinterpreted what they saw. In Jensen's opinion, the motive for the crime was revenge, and it was a very personal attack. In his opinion, the weapon was a heavy iron pipe, a metal pond. From the location of the bruising, it appears the blows were inflicted while they were bound in a sitting position, and they didn't try to defend themselves. The watches on their hands were intact. No defensive wounds. As for motive, he said Mrs. Murphy was the perpetrator's primary target, hence the missing finger and the injuries to her groin, and the fact that there were traces of feces, urine, and fecal matter on her body. Her husband worked as a lawyer and was considered quite powerful. He could have had enemies. But why attack the others? But this isn't just conjecture or theory. Mrs. Murphy's husband was going to file for divorce, but the woman didn't want a divorce. And Mr. Murphy, 50 years old, had a mistress. Her name was Marian Anderson, his new 39-year-old secretary. Shortly before the attacks on women, she became pregnant and gave birth. And there was a dash in the father's name on the baby's paperwork. Mr. Murphy would then marry her, adopt the child, and raise it as his own. And interestingly enough, a few years ago, the child was found and offered a DNA test. Well, he's an adult, of course, to find out who his father is. But he said it was a tough decision and needed to consider it. It is understandable because we don't know what the boy was told growing up, what he was told about his father, or what he has been told his whole life. It's just that if he is Mr. Murphy's son, given the mores of the time, that could be a motive. By the way, Mr. Murphy married very quickly, according to some accounts within a few months of his wife's death. And when both he and his secretary wife die, it is with his second wife that Mr. Murphy will be buried. I don't know how it's usually done in these situations, but Andy Hale was saying that they were supposed to be buried with the first wife. And here it's extraordinary that it's with the second wife. But that's not all. The area around Starved Drog Park and the nearby towns was pretty unsafe at the time, with Chicago still around. There were some natural organized crime groups living there, and the leader or some famous person among them was a confident Smokey Rona. It's like a movie name, and everything I'm about to tell you sounds like a gangster movie. It's a similar reality. Now, his sister, in 2005, claimed that his brother confessed to her on his deathbed to organizing the attack in Starved Dog Park. And deathbed confessions are rarely fiction or any nonsense, but using that as evidence in court would undoubtedly be not easy. Nevertheless, Andy Hale mentions all this as proof of Chester's innocence. Andy himself was then contacted by Smokey's friend Rona, who knew him personally and some of his secrets, even though he was much younger. According to him, the Mafia used Smokey Rona for dirty deeds, and Smokey told him about some of the cases, particularly the Starved Dog Park case. According to Smokey himself, it went like this. He got a call saying that a mutual friend of theirs needed help. A confident businessman wants his wife taken out. Smokey refused to do the assignment but said he would plan the whole thing for $30,000. He was given the details. The woman would be coming to Starved Dog with 2 friends, and they had to be taken out too, not just collateral damage. Smokey found the executors, and that's how it went down. The 3 men followed the women into the park. Smokey himself stayed by the cars. At some point, he heard a scream. That's all he remembers. About the method of murder, he said they came up with the idea of putting bags over the women's heads and faces and strangle them. But the problem was that it made the capillaries burst in their eyes, so it would be easy to see what was done to them. Well, and maybe it would somehow give a clue to the police. So they had to make it so that no capillaries could be seen. Hence, the brutal scene. That's all. The performers then changed their clothes and gave the dirty ones to Smokey, but he didn't know what to do with it, as he was afraid he would attract attention with the black smoke that would come from the fire if he burned it. So he kept the clothes with him for a while and finally decided to burn them, as they are called, in the neighborhood on trash burning day. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that happens there too. Remember that moment when he didn't know what to do and decided to burn it, because roughly the same thing appears in the testimony of a woman named Loisa Zelensik. She was working as a telephone operator when this crime was committed, and as late as the 20th of April, 1960, she told how she witnessed a strange conversation between 18 and 20 o'clock on the 21st of March. She was connecting 2 callers. A man from a tavern in Aurora was calling a man from a local town in Peru. Now, it often happened that the telephone operator would cut in after clicking the callers to let them know that their paid calling time was ending, and accidentally overhear what they were saying. And it was almost always bullshit, and they didn't even remember what was going on. And she was plugging in to tell them that that was it. The money was running out. And she overheard a man in Aurora say something like, "There's a kid in the trunk of his trunk with his overalls all blood-stained, and he's asking what he will do with them because he's afraid he will get caught." The man from Peru replies, "Tell this guy to get rid of them. Like, just burn them." They were also discussing some big articles. Like, there's a huge article in the paper about a murder. Did you see it? The big article about the Starved Rock case was on the front page on March 21st. It mentioned the testimony of a car salesman who saw a car parked at the park that fateful day. And there was a red-haired man next to it. He was talking to the women, and the other man was sitting inside. Based on the conversation, the telephonist realized that the second man talking worked as a car salesman, a car dealer. They must have been discussing some deal beforehand. It's a hell of a job. You know so much. You get in so much trouble. The call, she said, looked like a report to her boss. When she gave that information to the police, they could trace the call. Well, hey, it's not that hard. The first theory is that the callers were brothers Glenn and William Palmatier. Glenn owned a tavern that local gang members frequented, and he was calling William's house. But here's the problem. According to Lois, The man who reported to his boss sounded poorly educated. The two brothers were just that. Well, not super educated. But their speech was acceptable, and they didn't have any problems. One was a tavern owner, the other a car dealer. They both had to have a good tongue, and both later denied talking to each other on the phone that day. Glenn even passed a polygraph test. But what if the call from the tavern wasn't from Glenn but someone else? And he was asking about Ron's Smokies. Well, what's he going to do with all those bloody costumes? He says he's afraid of black smoke. And they tell him, burn the Dido, so he went and burned them. And, you know, here we go a little bit forward again. Do you see what these brothers became? They went into politics. One became chief of police and ran for mayor, and the other became mayor of Peru County. So if they knew somebody upstairs, they had a roof over their heads. And so you and I find ourselves deep under the water in this version of the Mafia. And I realize you can say that about any unsolved case. It was the Mafia. But look, at least there's something to go on here. And there are all kinds of sources of information that have nothing to do with each other at all. And that was either dug up by Andy Hale, or people called him after the HBO movie came out, or after his podcast came out. And that's precisely the case here. Andy Hale, I hope you haven't forgotten. Yes, that's Chester's lawyer. After the HBO documentary series came out, it was written to by a confident woman who asked to remain anonymous. She hadn't listened to the podcast where he discussed everything, including the Mafia version. She only knew about the HBO movie. She told a story that confirms everything we discussed above. When she was 15, her grandfather, who was dying of cancer, told her who the natural killer was in the Starved Rock Park case. Fair question. Why did her grandfather tell her specifically, and why did he tell her? First, because he wanted to tell someone, to confess before he died. And second, because he wanted to show her that she needed to get out of that dysfunctional neighborhood. And she was already starting to get involved in the Mafia, passing letters, sending packages for them, maybe doing other things. And she will be the first kid in their family to go to college and make an everyday life for herself. And the grandfather was tight with the local Mafia. And the main reason he confessed to his granddaughter was because his conscience was eating away at him. It was hard for him to see an innocent man behind bars. Chester didn't do it. The grandfather himself did not participate in the massacre, but only advised who should be taken into the team of executors. One of the women's husbands was the customer. The husband was angry at his wife and wanted to get back at her for something. 6 men went to the site, he said. Some stayed to see if there were any witnesses, and the others attacked the women. They didn't attack them in the cave, but somewhere else. And they put them down so they could show their husband the results of their work. I don't know. That was the wording. They brought all the tools with them and took them all back. They tracked the woman down for a long time beforehand, and even spent the night in a hotel. But here's the problem. The grandfather didn't tell his granddaughter the names of these perpetrators, even though he knew them. He did it to keep her safe. You know, well, it's weird though, man. If the Mafia knows she's the granddaughter, you might as well tell them now that you're telling them. And that grandfather. Pardon me for calling him that. His first and last name wasn't on the podcast either. He made her promise before he died that she would tell the world about it and get Chester released. But no one listened to her. She wrote letters to detectives, went to the police herself, and finally got through to Andy Hale. He, of course, was shocked because her story coincided with the stories of several other people and the facts he had dug up. Andy also speculated that those fabric pieces found at the crime scene probably came from the car. And it did. It's the material used to trim the inside of General Motors cars. It was also used to make blankets and plaids that could theoretically wrap the bodies as they were transported to the cave. And then they were burned. And this material burns black. Hence Smokeron's fear of black smoke. I hope you're not confused. and I hope you're as curious as I am. What else has come to light since the first episodes of the Andy Hale podcast were published? It was written to him that the chief adherent of the idea of Chester Weiger's guilt had anonymously turned over to the Los Al Historical Society documents that were kept in his garage. These documents were about the Chester Weiger case. This man's name was Steve Stout. He wrote a book about the case and was in close contact with everyone involved in Chester's capture, and he's been pushing for him to be guilty. And in the HBO documentary, he's sitting there all sad, like Chester is guilty, and he's right that he's sitting there. But it's hard to call the book objective because right in the preface, he thanks the detectives and, by extension, the prosecutors for helping him write it. I haven't read it because I couldn't order it, but if I find it, I'll put out a third installment about the case. No, he was kidding. Okay, I'll record a voiceover, probably on Telegram, so sign up. So here are the documents. First of all, this is just bullshit. You can't do that. I mean, who keeps criminal records in their garage? They belong in the archives. Secondly, Andy Hale got access to these documents because they were already in the Historical Society, and he found a lot of exciting things there. For example, one of the files indicated a forensic analysis, and it turned out that the branch, a kind of weapon, couldn't have fallen from any of the trees at that location. So somebody brought it in. There's also an interview with Glenn, who remember called his brother. On August 30th, Glenn talks to the police and assures them that he knows nothing. He hasn't named anyone, and he hasn't spoken to his brother in a long time. So the cops start going to his tavern. They follow him and find him talking to Albert Lupa Hardinas, and he's a Mafia guy. It's just confirmation of the brothers' Mafia connection. It also turns out that this same Glenn knew Robert Murphy, the husband of just one of those ladies who had the most damage. And interestingly, there are no transcripts of interviews or polygraphs with his brother, William. What if they didn't even talk to him, but they called him at home? If the caller was not Glenn but someone else with a low voice and poor vocabulary, as described by the telephonist, then Glenn may have been telling the truth in the interview that it was not him on the phone. But who was it anyway? That's an unanswered question. But the clue here is that on the 2nd of October, Harlan Warren, the prosecutor, writes an apology for the police questioning the brothers. It's been 3 days, and he's been so scared they've been threatened that he's officially apologizing to the brothers who are about to get into politics for the shadow of suspicion that has fallen over them. And that shadow, by the way, hasn't gone anywhere. All right, how did the issue get resolved on paper? Well, on paper, the suspicion of the brothers was decided this way. They said that Lois, the phone girl, made it all up. She didn't pass the polygraph, so she can't be trusted, and the brothers are clean. I think I can see why Steve Stout chose to keep these documents in his garage, because then his theory that Chester was 100 to blame falls apart. What else did Andy Hale dig up? He found a newspaper article that said the expert who did the polygraph examination when Chester was first suspected was, mind you, a friend of Robert Murphy's. Francis Murphy's husband? And get ready, Bill Dummett brought him into the case. And Harlan Warren. And all of them, as we recall, split the reward after Chester's capture. Andy Hale said he was ready to shout it from the highest mountain in the world and that it's something that he just can't keep to himself. And now talking about it, I understand his feelings. And the thing about this Bill Dummett guy, Andy Hale, was told that he'd put people away before for no reason. His job was to close the case as quickly as possible. Guilty or innocent, it didn't matter. So that's the kind of character he is. All right, let's keep going. Okay, we're almost at the finish line. Chester had a cousin. His name was Danny Rigger. And he didn't believe Chester was guilty. He did his investigation and talked to people. And in his own words, he was close to finding out. He even went to Chicago. But a few weeks later, he was found hanging from a tree off the highway. Random people saw him, a father and son who were driving by. According to them, his hands were tied. Police arrived, and witnesses were asked to leave. The report lists the man found as almost a John Doe, identity unknown. And he's old, dark-skinned man. While Cousin Chester is white and not an older man, he is 32. The change in skin color from suffocation is easily distinguishable from someone with a different skin color from birth. Nevertheless, Denny was buried that way in an unmarked grave. When word of this reached Denny's family, the relatives got an exhumation and were able to prove that he was the one who had provided the checks for the watch and ring. This was in the 70s. And this whole situation makes my eyes water. What was it? Who did it? If he was close to solving it and was so much involved in the case, why did he kill himself? And couldn't it be that he had help in this and then tried to cover it all up by putting him down as a dark-skinned man of age? So, what about this case now? Andy Hale has had multiple meetings with Chester. He promises he'll get him found innocent and clear his name, and if he succeeds, it will be the most extended illegal incarceration in the United States. Chester, like any octogenarian, already has health problems. And it is unknown whether he will live to see this moment, but he is being cared for by his sisters and nieces. And for starters, Andy Hale got a second DNA analysis of the hair found at the crime scene. And the results show that it wasn't Chester's hair. Now it's official. But it's certainly not enough to drop the charges. But there are still a few holes in this case. How did so many people keep it a secret if it's Mafia? There's only one grandfather who told the whole story. Why did Chester change his story? He still does. There were a few moments in the HBO movie where he was confused about words and facts, saying, "No, I shaved." He was like, "No, I didn't shave at all." You can chalk it up to age, but Anthony Raculia's son believes Chester is probably innocent. But even he said that, geez, that moment was a little weird. And he doesn't think that Chester is all white and fluffy. He could know something, or see something, or hide something, or cover for someone. Chester also wrote a letter to his son Anthony Raculia, who did the documentary for HBO. And there, he said that as a child, he was very traumatized by the fact that his sister was raped in front of him. And ever since then, he hasn't been able to hurt or hurt anyone at all. Even his wife he chose, not a virgin, he said, so as not to hurt her. However, as Dave Raculia says, such trauma can go in the opposite direction, especially when you consider that he was accused of sexualized abuse when he was young. And sort of like his parents even saw it, well, I mean, the traces and evidence. But Andy Hale believes his client 100%. In 2022, he sent all the documents to the district attorney, but in December, he received a refusal to drop the charges. There weren't enough facts he'd gathered in favor of Chester's innocence. But interestingly enough, no one even contacted the witnesses. When Andy Hale started this case, they didn't want to give him access to the archives, saying everything was in a terrible state. Generally, it was a mess. And when he finally got access through the court, he saw with his own eyes that everything was fine. All the evidence was well preserved, and there were perfect glasses. Everything was signed, stacked. He even got a DNA test. That's how we remember. And now, he's gone further with genealogy services, looking for someone whose hair it might have ended up being. In March of 2023, Andy Hale filed a lawsuit, and the court has 90 days to consider all the evidence of Chester's innocence. So the results, you can imagine, will be in any day now. And on top of that, he filed for a change of prosecutor because his old prosecutor was uncooperative, or even interfere with his case in general, which begs the question, why are they hiding all this? Why are they obstructing him? And why won't they agree to consider new evidence? That's the story, folks. I get the feeling that there are more questions than answers here. I won't give my opinion yet, but this is precisely what I think. I want to read your comments. clarify something if something suddenly seems unclear, and then think about it more. However, I've been thinking about this case for probably months now, and you know, this is one of those cases that gets more interesting over time. And by more interesting, I mean what's going on right now, and this whole, who's to blame, who's not to blame. 3 people lost their lives, and they deserve justice first and foremost. Their relatives deserve to know who did it. They have said, by the way, again, I'm going on. But basically, they said in the documentary that they don't want to bring up the case again because it was excruciating, and this is the whole thing to go through again. But Andy Hale, I'm of roughly the same opinion, says, well, how? How can you not know who did it? I mean, they want to think that Chester Weiger did it, and he did his time, and that's it. He paid, well, conditionally, for it. And here, they will have to accept the fact that, he wasn't guilty, and someone was free, and maybe he died peacefully. He was buried a happy man there, with 1 million grandchildren. Can you imagine that? If you've watched this video to the end, if you've watched both parts to the end, then please put a like and send this video to your friends. I'm sure they'll like it too. They'll be interested and want to pore over this case too. It was so good to sit in front of the camera and talk about this case. I'll pass the word to you and say goodbye until the next video. Good night, everyone, and goodbye.